I'm James Governor, co-founder of RedMonk, and I'm here at Hasuracon 2020 to talk about data-driven application development in the cloud. So I think there was a really pretty profound question posed by Sam Gerstenzang in 2014 when he asked how long before we have $1 billion acquisition offer for a one-engineer startup. At first sight, that sort of sounds ludicrous, but of course, we've got pretty close to that. WhatsApp had 450 million users, it had 32 engineers, and it sold to Facebook for $19 billion. So that's within striking distance of this idea that Sam had, and I think about that a lot when I think about developer productivity and the opportunities we have in the modern economy where we have cloud platforms and a rich service ecosystem that developers can tap into. Think about a platform like SAP and Ariba, $3.3 trillion of commerce flowing through that platform on an annual basis. That is incredible. And again, that's the sort of numbers that we're thinking about, what are the opportunities for developers in terms of tapping into that? Talking of developers, there are 50 million users on GitHub today. GitHub uses those as a proxy for developers. I think that number's high. We're probably more like 20, 25 million developers, somewhere in that region. But 50 million users is still pretty impressive for GitHub. Some of them might be product managers, some of them might be documentation people, some of them might be in marketing. A lot of those might be multiple accounts, frankly. But still, 50 million users of GitHub. And of those 50 million users, maybe one of them out there has an idea that's going to be that huge exit where they're going to create a massive business because of the opportunities that platforms today have created. Who am I? I'm Monk Chips, James Governor, as I've said, from RedMonk. I spend a lot of time on Twitter. It's a great research tool if you want to track software developers and their behaviors. That's what we do. There are many research firms that track top-down software and technology adoption. We look at it from the bottom up. What are the engineers and practitioners using? Why are they using it? What's happening in their culture? Why are they making the decisions they do? That's how we try and understand the industry. So what's happened in recent years in terms of software development and opportunities? We've got less code, write less yourself, less complexity, at least in terms of the code that developers are using. Cloud platforms are abstracting that complexity. Less reinvention. We can't be reinventing the wheel all the time. Why, it's fine to build your own CMS as an experiment, but you shouldn't be doing that for every project that you run. High productivity, high scale, these are all things that we expect today and the platforms are giving to us rather than something we need to build ourselves. The rich service ecosystem, the rich ecosystem of open source software that we have access to, and increasingly more and more self-service. We're in a world where the developer no longer needs to ask for permission. If there's an itch to be scratched, whether their own or the business or enterprises, that's something that they can do. This is a new world. Developer-led technology adoption has changed the game. Arguably, this entire transition to cloud was driven by developers. So it wasn't CIOs that made this decision. We quite often in the early days of cloud would go into a business and we'd say, what is your public cloud strategy? The CIO might say, oh no, we don't use public cloud. That's not a corporate standard. Of course, you'd go in and you'd find immediately that you began talking to people in the business that cloud was a thing, that people were using Amazon. Perhaps they were building a content, perhaps they were using it as a content store. But the simple fact was whether CIOs knew it, well, the CIOs were the last to know. Cloud came in and was adopted as an engineering-led phenomenon. Of course, on the other side, you also had another vector of adoption of cloud. You could go in and say, what's your cloud strategy? And again, oh, we don't use the cloud. What was the Salesforce using? They were using Salesforce. It was so easy to adopt that a lot of the permission-based activities just went out of the window. Cloud, most recently, we've seen a new wave of technology that's beginning to create an economic disruption, I think. So serverless technology is very interesting. It's not just a technology, it's an economy. So if we think about serverless technology, where you don't necessarily actually even need to pay the cloud platform for the service unless the user is actively using it, that's an incredible change in terms of the economics of what we can build and how we can build it. So for so many of those activities, it's almost like everything becomes batch, and we don't need to pay for the infrastructure except when we're using it. Recently, the serverless community has begun to talk about this notion of serviceful. There are these different platforms out there that it's not like build your own Lambda function. We've got access to an ecosystem of services, things like Algolia, things like Cloudinary, where, for the developer, they can begin to take a best-of-breed approach, choose platforms that they like, that are highly productive, and pull those together to create new services and applications for end users. I've jokingly talked about the new stack being React and GraphQL. That's it. I think this is the interesting thing, that we're increasingly in a world where the interaction is provided at the browser or the application. And at the back end, there are just a rich set of API services that are being called. Now, this is reductive, obviously, in the same way that serverless, in fact, there are a bunch of servers there and things being managed, but you don't need to manage them. In this two-tier world, who are the providers of rich services that we can tap into? There is some middleware there, but it's not something the developer needs to worry about. For me, this sort of goes back to the idea of what emerged as the Mashup ecosystem. We'd come out of this world of XML and complexity, and with RESTful APIs and some really interesting services, namely if we think about the Google Maps combined with something like Flickr, you could begin to create these profound and interesting applications for end users in the form of a mashup. And that was an ecosystem, and it began to make us think about a different way of developing and delivering applications. Now, jump forward, more than a decade, a bunch of time has passed by, and most recently we're all getting excited about something called Jamstack. So that's JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And that came out of the world of again, a developer-led phenomenon. How can we have basically faster websites? This idea of rendering every page as you went along didn't really make sense for performance reasons, and developers began to use what are called static site generators, and that was for them in a way of really increasing performance. It wasn't completely as user-friendly as some other platforms, but it was highly productive for them in the sorts of workflows they had, and performance was everything. What then happened is, it was like, how do we make these applications more interactive? How can we call other APIs? And that was where the API story came in, and Jamstack became a reality. Now, Amazon has been building tools that use these sorts of approaches. If we look at Amplify and the idea that you've got the framework, AWS services, and developer tools, all held together by sort of GraphQL, making things highly productive for the developer, this is increasingly the model that we're seeing teams that want to, again, they don't want to ask for permission, but they do want to be highly productive and beginning to use. Rich set of API services that they can access. What does this world kind of look like? So on the serviceful world, you might be using Stripe for your e-commerce processing. You might want to use Cognito for your identity stuff. You might want to use Auth0. That might be your choice. Cloudinary for those media assets. Algolia for text search. Then you want a public cloud that you're bound to be developing and deploying some of the application to Azure or to GCP, to Google Cloud Platform, or to AWS. But then what about the old world of applications? SAP, Salesforce, Workday. When I talk about SAP, it might be Concur, it might be Ariba that I've mentioned. And of course, you've got that rich heritage of legacy applications that are now running on platforms like VMware and Red Hat Linux, RHEL. So how do we begin to pull all this together, and what's that going to look like for a developer that's grown up with serverless and Jamstack kind of ideas? And perhaps we need something new. Perhaps there needs to be a new model. Because to me, when I look at it, increasingly, we are moving into a multi-cloud world. But that doesn't mean you want to build one application that can run anywhere. On the contrary, you want to take the best of each platform and compose new services for your end users. So when I was doing the research for this talk, I came across basically a reply when I asked from Mark Hinkle. And he's one of the founders of Trigger Mesh. And they're now talking about Smokestack. And I think this is really interesting. I've talked about Serviceful and Mashable, this open network, and something that is composite and event-driven. So it's not an alternative to Jamstack, but it's a slightly different way of looking at the world. So those Lambda functions are all about event-driven computing. But of course, events happen all over the place, and they are going to connect to persistent store. We are going to have applications that do have ongoing access to data. And I think we're at a bit of an inflection point. How do we pull together, a service that is is managed with an Auth0 identity that is tying into both SAP and Salesforce and some of those other third-party services, and some functionality that we built and deployed on that cloud, on that public cloud, or on-prem. What are we missing though? Does that go far enough? We can't put everything in one cloud. That's part of the problem we've got. Amazon, for sure, if we do that, there are going to be egress charges. We can't throw data around all the time because, frankly, moving data is expensive. So we need a simple operating model and a simple development model. GraphQL is likely to be part of that in this world of APIs. Egress costs that are not going to kill you. So could we start to federate? Could we start to leave data where it is when we create these new applications? How can we do that? How can we manage these events in different places? How could we create applications that leave the data where it is, that's a fully managed service? Because I think that's where we need to go. Into this question of cross-cloud integration. There are different approaches. I mentioned Trigger Mesh. They're very much building a serverless application platform on top of Kubernetes that allows us to start firing events together. There are going to be a lot of vendors that start to do sort of offload platforms so that you're not running everything on Amazon Web Services, so you're not running everything on GCP. Some of this is going to be edge computing. We're going to see these serverless functions from the like of Fastly or Cloudflare. But when it comes to data-driven applications, I do think there is a massive opportunity for someone to start tying some of those requirements together and building new platforms, because we're definitely going to see more hybrid cloud, but it's serviceful hybrid cloud. People are going to make decisions and use the best tool for the job. So I'm really interested to see, frankly, what we're going to hear from Hasura over the next couple of days, whether it's going to start to deliver functionality there. Because I know there's a massive opportunity for developers to be more productive than they've ever been before. And that's why I'm excited to be part of Hasuracon 2020 this week.